Mainly Becki, wherever I...
The new and changing NRS standards, and we're doing this in small pieces. So this is the first in a series of webinars that we're going to be doing. And in this one, we're just talking about participants and reportable individuals. We're also going to take a look at the new intake form and at some barriers to employment with our participants, so which is a required part of intake now under WIOA. So we'll go ahead and get started. These are the 6 key issues that the NRS has identified under WIOA. And you can see the first one is participants and reportable individuals. That's what we're going to be discussing today. In subsequent webinars, we're going to be talking about program entry and exit and periods of participation, measurable skill gains, employment performance, credential attainment, and then we're also going to be talking about participant exclusions from indicators as we move through the other topics. So if you're planning to be with us for all of the webinars, those are the topics you can expect to cover. So today, though, our topic is participants and reportable individuals, and there are some changes to terminology under WIOA and the new NRS guidelines. A participant now is someone who has achieved 12 contact hours after program entry. These are the people who are reported on our NRS tables and our statewide performance report tables, and they count towards our performance measures. So someone is a participant once they have completed their enrollment, completed their assessment, and achieved 12 contact hours in our program. That's a participant. A reportable individual, on the other hand, is someone who has provided us identifying information. So they may have completed all or part of an intake with us, and they've taken an action that demonstrates an intent to use program services. So they have made us believe that they really are interested in coming in for GED services or English language services into our program, but they have gotten less than 12 contact hours. So if they've got less than 12 hours, they're a reportable individual. If they have 12 hours or more, they're a participant. I don't know about all of you, but I used to think about this the other way around. We used to talk about reportables as the people who would populate on the reports. That's not the case anymore. The reportables are the people who have less than 12 contact hours, and they will not show up on our reports. Any questions about that?
Can you hear me? This is Laura.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I started talking and I was on mute, so I realized that wasn't going to work very well. And I believe this is something we'll address in the next slide perhaps, but one of the distinctions between the participant and the reportable is how they show up on the data tables. Isn't that right?
That is correct, and yes, that's a good segue into our next slide. So what's new? The definition of a reportable individual is new. A participant still needs to have that 12 hours, the intake, the assessment done, but the reportables now are someone who we have some information on. Like I said, maybe they've completed all of an intake or even part of an intake, so we have perhaps just contact information on them and an indication that they're interested in joining our program. They may have also completed an assessment but just not gotten to that 12-hour mark yet. In the past, those reportable individuals, the people with less than 12 hours, have not shown on any of our NRS tables. That's still the case for this fiscal year, for this program year. However, the plans are that there will be in the future a table 2A where those reportable individuals will show. So this has some implications for us as service providers. In the past, the rule has always been, I believe at the state level, that if someone had completed their intake, completed their assessment, and come to at least 1 hour of class, we should enroll that person in LACES. Now, that person is considered a reportable individual as soon as they complete the intake, regardless of whether or not they complete the assessment or attend any classes with us. So we're going to be expected to report on those people in future NRS tables. As of right now, that is the plan. Any questions or comments on that? kind of a big change.
And my notes, this is Laura again, my notes just indicate that it was projected Table 2A will be available July 1st, 2017.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, that's so not this program year, but next program year, we're going to be expected to be able to report on all of those people. What is that information going to be used for? We don't know. It's just a decision that they've made at the federal level, that they would like to see those numbers as well. So it will mean probably a little bit more data entry time for the person who's your data entry specialist in your program. Any questions or comments? All right. Then let's think a little bit about the intake to our program, because again, if somebody completes even part of the intake to our program, they're going to be considered a reportable person. And there have been some changes to intake requirements under WIOA. We have a new set of features for our intake form that are called the barriers to employment. Did everybody get the document that had the definitions of those barriers to employment prior to the webinar today, and did you have a chance to look through it?
Yes and yes.
Thank you. So I've got the barriers to employment listed up here, and I don't want to spend a great deal of time going through every single one of them, other than to say the barriers to employment are now a required feature at intake. We do need to capture this information on each of our people who comes in and completes an intake with us. And the barriers to employment they can be a combination of self-reported information and observed information. So for example, someone might not tell you that they feel they have cultural barriers to employment, but if their language skills are very limited, if they have a difficult time with some of the constructs of our culture related to employment, such as time management, being on time, maintaining attendance, those kinds of things, due to cultural issues, we will recognize that they might have some cultural barriers there if it's someone that we've done some work with. Someone might not consider themselves long-term unemployed, but if you look at the definition of long-term unemployed, that participant has been unemployed for 27 or more consecutive weeks at program entry. So they might say, well, no, I haven't been out of work for a long time. Well, how long has it been since you worked? Well, it's been 7 months. That's long-term unemployed. So we can make those determinations as well. Does anybody have any questions? I'm just going to pop up my barriers to employment document here. Does anybody have any questions related to any of those specific barriers and how you might work with them on a regular basis with participants or determine the barriers that a person has? No? Just a couple highlights. Just remember when you ask about disabilities, if a person does not want to disclose their disability status, you do not check that disability. One of the interesting things that I found was under displaced homemaker, I never realized, and I have worked with this field before when we provided more Title I-based services, I never realized that the dependent spouses of armed forces members were considered displaced homemakers as well. So that was an interesting thing for me. Economic disadvantage. Did anybody have any questions about how to tell whether someone was an economically disadvantaged participant? Because this is one, sometimes it's easy. If they're receiving SNAP, if they're receiving TANF, if they're receiving SSI, those are automatic yeses according to the definition. But this next one, a family with a total family income that does not exceed the higher of the poverty line or 70% of the lower living standard income level, difficult, you know, and if we don't understand what that means, how are we to expect participants to understand? So one of the things that I had sent out to you is this WIOA low-income guideline information. This came to us from Bill McIntaffer at Department of Labor and Regulation, and he provided us with this, this handy little guide to be able to tell when someone meets that low-income standard. So you look at the family size and their annual income or their 6-month income, and that's how you determine whether or not they are below that level and whether they meet that economic disadvantage definition. And you can see if they have a family size over 6, for each additional person you add $5,183 to their annual income. So that's a tool that you can use when you're trying to determine whether someone meets that definition for economic disadvantage. Okay. Our English language learners, you know, this is one, just because they're an English language learner doesn't necessarily mean that that language is a barrier to employment. However, we've had some discussions where we really need to take into consideration what a learner's goals are, because some of our students are very fluent orally, but they keep coming to class because they want to build their reading and writing skills so they can get into a higher level position, maybe a supervisory level position. So their language skills are still a barrier to them achieving their employment goal. So in that case, I would probably check that English language learner is a barrier for that student. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Laura, do you have any thoughts on that one or insight?
I would just, my sense is that English language learner really applies broadly to anyone meeting those 2 conditions listed in your handy cheat sheet here, that their native languages other than English and that their family in their home environment, a language other than English is dominant. So certainly that applies to everyone that we encounter in our own program.
Sure.
So I would agree. I mean, even people that we meet who've lived in the United States for 20 years and are highly educated indicate that they're still on that spectrum of being an English language learner. They're not done developing their skills. So if they've come to our program, it's most likely that they still qualify as having that as a barrier. Even professionals indicate that as a barrier. So I would agree.
Very good. Thanks.
I have a question, and I just have waited.
Sure.
This is Royce, because
Sure.
I didn't realize you were going on English language. Can I go back to the income thing?
Sure.
You were actually going to look about the low poverty area thing, right?
Oh, the youth living in a high poverty area? Yeah, and I've not been able to find a good reliable source of information for that on a widespread basis.
Okay.
You know, what constitutes a high poverty area. Have you had any luck with that, Royce?
Well, the only definition I could find was that night that I looked, and it seemed like we were. I mean,
okay. Yeah.
I'm wondering if a school district is noted as being, which one is it? For high poverty, you know, there's certain titles for school districts, and maybe like sometimes an entire school district is, sometimes a section of a community is. If you live within that, would you think that that could constitute some type of part of that definition? You know,
I think that would be a rational one. Yeah.
I can't remember which title it is, though.
I was just going to ask about the 70% of the lower living standard. Is that just covered by the sheet that you gave us in the attachment? Yeah. I don't know what the difference between it says the higher of the poverty line or 70%. So just go by the numbers in the attachment?
Yep, just go by the numbers in the attachment and you'll be fine.
Okay, gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
The high poverty area thing, like I said, I looked into it, and the only federal definition I could find was not related to this at all.
Right.
I don't remember what it was, and it also depends on the area. Like the census area is like Vermilion itself is a census area, and then there's kind of like Clay County, in which case we're not. So.
Right, sure. Well, and maybe we can get some additional guidance on what information we use to determine whether we're living in a high poverty area. So thank you. That's a good question, Royce. Like I said, I don't want to get into each one of these. I'm just going to kind of try and hit some high points where we thought there might be some discussion. Ex-offenders or people who have been subject to any stage of the criminal justice process that they feel has created a barrier to employment for them. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that they've been convicted of a crime. If they've had, just had arrests and feel that those arrests have led to them being unable to get jobs or get the kind of jobs that they want, then they might perceive that as a barrier to employment, and you could mark it. The exiting TANF within 2 years, you're going to have to rely on your partner agencies to help you with that. I'm not sure that even participants would be aware of that designation. I did want to talk a little bit about the homelessness one. In the past, we've always been told don't mark homeless as far as our programs because that's only people who are receiving services within a shelter situation. That's not true for these barriers to employment. Any of the descriptions that you see here designate someone as having a barrier of homelessness, and so we would take those into consideration when marking this as a barrier. However, there was apparently at one of the trainings that Laura and I did not attend for the NRS, at one of the other sessions, there was quite a discussion about the second bullet point here, the term trailer park. We have a lot of people who live in mobile homes in our communities, and some of them are really nice. So, to say that anyone who lives in a trailer park is homeless is kind of bizarre to us. Our suspicion is that they mean like living in like a campground kind of trailer park, that kind of trailer park. So, I would say just let common sense be your guide on that one. If they're living in a mobile home community where their houses are on a fixed lot and they do have a mailing address there, I would not call them homeless. I would call that a fixed regular residence. So any other questions or comments on that one?
So for that first bullet point, the sharing the housing of other persons, like that's just anybody that's like not on the lease?
It could be, yeah. I mean, depending on the relationships of the people in the house. If it's just somebody who's staying there not paying rent, it could be, yes. If it's an 18-year-old living with their parents still, I might not call them homeless. I mean, technically, do they fit the definition? Maybe. But I think, the rest of that, due to the loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason, would be your determiner there.
Okay, so it could apply just to people in doubled up housing.
Right, right. Any other questions? All right. Long-term unemployed, we already talked about the low literacy levels. Again, they don't really give a grade equivalent level here, but just they're unable to read, write, speak in English, compute, and solve problems at levels of proficiency necessary to function on the job, in the family, or in society. So they leave it pretty broad as far as the definition there. And again, I think this one is at your discretion and at the discretion of the participant. If they feel that their academic abilities are limiting them in the job search or in society or with their family, then you would definitely mark this. If you're seeing, especially if you're seeing assessed levels low enough to indicate that they would maybe struggle with some of those skills that they needed on the job or in society, then definitely you could mark this one as well. Questions about that?
The whole issue with this that we kind of talked about in January is like we have to be able to perceive this upon intake, right?
Right,
Or we
right.
can't go back and change it.
Well, here's the thing. I think, we do have some latitude, and John, maybe you want to jump in here as well with your thoughts on this. We found out in our LACES training on Friday that we do have some latitude if something is marked or not marked and we think we need to make a change. So John, what is your feeling, if we are putting these intakes in right away, maybe before assessment is done, and then subsequently on assessment we realize, oh, they really do have low literacy levels, do you think that we would be encouraged to go in and mark that, or do you think it would be better left unmarked?
Oops.
Did we lose him?
I think we may have.
Uh-oh. Okay.
I actually don't see him on here.
Okay, we might have lost him. I will try and get some clarification from John on that, Royce, because yeah, Shannon did tell us that we do have the ability to go in and make adjustments to those things, especially if there's like if we make an error in data entry. But I don't know how much changing John would want us to do on those barriers. So that's a good question. I wish I had the answer for you.
Well, because that's always a question I've had with that box on the intake form that's like adult basic or adult secondary. I'm always like, how do I know?
Yeah, yeah.
Becki, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, I could hear the conversation and I don't know. I'm sure it's probably user error with my headset. So I would like to ask some follow-up questions related to how we're going to handle some of these items. And, in that distinction between participant and reportable, and then thinking of this from a purely data entry, data collection perspective, do we have a class within our agency for prospectives or for rather reportables as we orient the student and the teacher to the instruction activities and services, in fewer than 12 hours? Because to that question, at what point is it no longer the initial intake? And, what do these nuances mean for group intake? If some entities have been, more having adult secondary and adult basic participants complete these student intake forms on their own and self-identifying these perceived barriers, what does that mean for group intake? Are we going to need to, do this on a one-by-one basis? And even another question on top of that, how do we want to handle situations where it becomes, a matter of teacher determined or identified barrier versus a student identified barrier? Should there be some negotiation, or if a student, identifies that they don't want to disclose a disability or any other barrier, then that's where it ends until the next full period of participation.
Yeah, and to the best of my knowledge, Sean, we've not received any guidance from the federal level on any of those questions. Is that correct?
Not to that level of specificity, and certainly not until we get those new NRS implementation guidelines. So, I mean, in part they're rhetorical, but on the other hand, I'd like to ask you directly, is it possible to have a group orientation outside from the identification of employment barriers? Because I would think we could mount a good argument that through case management, we're not going to be able to identify all the complexities of one of these homeless housing situations at first onset or, at first introduction. We need to build some rapport. And to me, I think we can mount a good argument. Any of these data that we can collect in the first 12 hours should be considered initial data, but, rather than those first hour and a half when you're getting a release of information form. Thoughts?
That's kind of how I have approached it, John, in our own program. As people send me the initial intake, if there's not an assessment done yet, they're not enrolled in a class yet, and then I consider them, they're reportable at that point, but they're not a participant. So I would consider them still in the intake process at that point because they've not yet enrolled. So yes, I would agree with you.
What about this, and I'll be skipping around here, sorry, the exiting TANF within 2 years. I know many of you have worked with DSS in the past. Do you know if there's some sort of data match possibility? Do you find it very difficult or compromising to be collecting these particular data?
Just speaking for myself, John, I don't think that the participants even know if they're within 2 years.
Yeah, I don't know how we'd ever collect that accurately.
Well, and anecdotally, even in the past under WIA, when it came to these items, it was very much, are you on public assistance? No. Oh, do you get EBT or food stamp? Oh, well, yes. And housing assistance? Well, yes. And so, yeah, I mean, so much of this is our verbiage, or that those realizations aren't made in that initial 3 hours. But if this ultimately, if these barriers, reported barriers, ultimately impact significantly our statistical adjustment model, how much effort should we be making to, as professionals, as educators, making these determinations ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
And then as a related parallel, I think about the race and ethnicity questions, and in certain entities, I remember corrections, there would be like Hispanic, Latino, and then you have to identify a race. Are you white, Hispanic, Latino, or Asian? And it got almost confrontational, and I don't want to be at a point where we make our participants uneasy or defensive because of our need to collect additional or negotiate additional barriers when we haven't even developed rapport.
Sure.
Thoughts?
I think I like your idea of thinking of the first 12 hours as the intake period, John, and I think that gives us a little bit of latitude to, as you say, build those relationships, determine some of the things that are going on with our students, and if you're comfortable with us being able to go back in and adjust that barrier data within that 12-hour period, I think that's a reasonable start, at least, to answering some of these questions.
Yeah, and I think it just needs to be then noted in our assessment policy, and that can be updated and resubmitted to the feds at any time, as we revisit some of these issues. Earlier you were addressing, I thought, a very good question in terms of what is it, how do we define youth living in high poverty area? And, we could, compile these or collate them and share them with both our federal education and labor partners. Mm-hmm. And they've been pretty quick to respond now that final rules are out in terms of some really specific guidance. So, yeah, I'd like to help facilitate some of that too. So thanks for helping us address these or identify these questions and articulate our needs for additional guidance.
Very good. Yeah, that was one of my hopes that we would get from this, is some more good questions to be asking, because we've been asking them of ourselves for quite some time now. So yeah, I think that those are all very good points to bring up and good things to think about as we start moving forward and gathering some of this data. These next two, I think, have confused everyone since the beginning of time. Seasonal farm worker and migrant and seasonal farm worker, which are actually two separate things. The seasonal farm worker is a low-income individual who has been primarily employed in agriculture or fish farming labor, characterized by chronic unemployment or underemployment, who faces multiple barriers to economic self-sufficiency or a dependent of that person. And then the migrant and seasonal farm worker is someone who meets that above definition, but whose work also requires them to travel to a job site and not return to a permanent place of residence within the same day, or they're dependent. So actually two separate things. You can be a seasonal farm worker without being migrant. And I think that's a distinction that many of us have missed in the past. I know I have. So just be aware that those are two separate things, and they're actually two separate boxes in the barriers section of the intake form and of LACES. And then the last one, single parent or guardian, we're all very familiar with that one, I think. But I do think it bears noting that it's an individual who has primary responsibility for the dependent children under age 18. So if they are a single parent who does not have primary responsibility for that child, if they've just, for example, got visitation, then I would not categorize them as a single parent. Questions or comments on that one? If you think I'm reading it wrong, you can always tell me.
No, I think you have that right, but let me ask, was that single pregnant women historically part of the definition or determination there of single parent?
It generally has been.
Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah, it generally has been. So yeah, you get one more awkward question to ask. So, all right, so that's a quick review of the barriers. And again, that document is there as a reference and resource. I continually go back to it in my own data entry and intake processes just to review and remind myself what those things are. So let's talk about this a little bit. So if somebody is employed, then they don't have any barriers to employment, right? Would you agree?
I would not.
Okay. I don't think so either. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I think that, yeah, even people who are employed do have barriers to employment. They might be in a job that, you know, is a very low-skilled position, maybe a minimum wage job, maybe they're working 2 part-time jobs. They still have barriers to achieving the employment that they want to achieve. And so I would still question them on those barriers, even if they are employed, because if they're there with us working on building their skills, hopefully it's to some end that might include better employment or different employment. So yes, I would still collect barriers to employment even on those who are employed. Any other thoughts or feelings on that one? Again, you can disagree with me if you want to.
This is Laura. I might also consider just plain and simple retention of employment to be another component of that.
That's an excellent point, Laura. Yes, because you might have a job, but you might not be good at keeping it. That's a very good point. And you might not have the skills to keep it. And in this job market today, you know, sometimes it's easier to get hired than to stay working. So, very good. The next one, what if the student I'm doing intake with doesn't have enough English to understand and identify barriers to employment? Do we just not mark any? Are there some that we can mark?
This is a great question.
English language learner, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah, that seems like a gimme, is the English language learner. At that point, and maybe the low literacy skills as well, just because that does say that they're unable to read, write, and speak in English. at a level that allows them to function in society. So if they can't answer those questions, I would say that they qualify for those low literacy levels as far as their English language skills. Any other thoughts, Laura? I thought I heard you start to say something.
I just said that's really a good question. Amy and I were just commiserating over how it is certainly challenging to get data from a limited English speaker on some of these categories. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That we wouldn't have the funding to have an interpreter for every enrollment to really get to the bottom of whether someone is has economic disadvantage, for example, or exiting TANF within 2 years, even if they did know the answer to that. But we definitely try to use creative ways of asking questions that are really, really simplified for barriers like this, and just do the best that we can to determine things. And sometimes we have individuals that we've seen on a repeated basis and just know more about their situation and can connect with them on some of those questions, but other times it's really difficult to get that information other than those given ones about cultural barriers, English language learner, and low literacy levels that are going to be really evident in that communication process.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that we've actually done at Cornerstones that apparently has worked well, I have not had an opportunity to use it since we created it, is we did a laminated sheet that has different forms of identification. This is when we need to ask for ID to help us with someone who doesn't have English language skills to maybe tell us their address, their birth date, those kinds of things. And we included on that card as well screenshots of a Dakota EBT card and a South Dakota medical benefits card. So we can just lay the picture in front of the person and point to it, and then they know, oh, I have one of those, because they'll recognize what it looks like. And they know they've got one in their wallet or in their bag, and they'll pull it out and show it to us. And that's one way we can determine if they do have an economic disadvantage that's related to either receiving EBT or medical benefits, which are two of the ones on that economic disadvantage chart that tell us something. So it's apparently worked pretty well for the people who've been able to use it.
It works well. I use it on the weekend.
Because, yeah, we don't always have people who speak the language either who can help us.
Yeah, basically never on the weekend do I have anyone. So it's totally my interpretation and my bad foreign language skills.
Yeah. Another question, do English language learners who are working have cultural or skill barriers to employment? And we talked about this a little bit already. What are your thoughts about that?
Sometimes.
Yeah, exactly, sometimes. And that's, again, where you might need to have a little more time with that participant to determine, you know, their goals, their ability, again, to retain their employment, and what they hope to gain from our classes. So, yeah, that's a could be, could not be kind of situation. So I think sometimes it's a perfectly appropriate answer there. And we need to do a little more investigation.
Those cultural barriers on the spectrum of English proficiency from pre-literate through native level at the post-secondary level. I mean, would we, beyond non-native speakers or Native Americans, Alaskan natives, would we see what we think of as a traditional homogeneous majority individual fit this often? Would, in terms of, I don't know, soft skills or social capital or interpersonal awareness, or, you know what I mean, emotional intelligence? Who's going to be within what's the range of our participants who will be in this realm, and should this be a way to track potential referrals for soft skills as well as others, the Bring Your A game?
Well, I think, you know, some of the practices that might hinder employment could certainly be covered in some of that soft skills training. you know, when you think about attendance, punctuality, those kinds of things, if you want to consider those as cultural barriers as well, it could be, I suppose. I had not thought of it that way, John, but I think it probably very well could be.
Would students who were raised in a Hutterite or Mennonite colony, or students who were, I don't know, yeah, I just...
It could be, yeah. I think that that's a valid question. I do. You know, I'm not sure I have a be-all and end-all answer for it, but I definitely think that there could be other considerations there, and not just our English language learners, certainly.
Yeah, like if the culture of poverty counts as a different culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. So yeah, I think, you know, there too, that might be a question to pass on to our federal partners and see what their take on that might be. Very good. Do they have to have been in jail to be an ex-offender?
Wouldn't they be out of jail already? Done with jail?
Yeah.
To be
yeah,
ex?
but they, you know, they could be, yeah, they could technically be an ex-offender without having served time in jail as well.
Right.
Yeah, so yeah, they would not necessarily have to have been incarcerated, and would not have to be incarcerated right now in order to be an ex-offender, certainly. So, and how low are low literacy? Oh, sorry.
The definition for that is so loose, though. It's just any stage of the criminal justice process.
Right.
So
yeah.
I'm assuming they don't mean acquittals.
I would guess not. But, you know, if you've got somebody who's maybe facing charges, and we get them a lot of times, you know, that they're before a court date and they want to start working on their GED because it looks good. So they could be in process that way. So we could consider them under that definition as being an ex-offender in that situation, if they think that it's a barrier to their employment. Yeah. We've talked a little bit about this one, how low are low literacy levels. And again, I think it depends on the situation and the goals of the learner, as far as are they functioning as barriers to the employment that they want, and to the retention of employment. And again, those are questions, like I say, that aren't best answered the first time you sit down with a student. So I think John's point is very salient, that we maybe need to think about some policy changes to change the way we think about the intake span of our students. So. Very good. And do they have to be living in a shelter to be homeless? And we talked about this one. No, not necessarily. That fixed permanent residence is a big thing. And, you know, we have a lot of students who actually are kind of couch surfing with friends or different family members and don't have that fixed permanent address. So that's a big factor for some of our participants.
Hey, Becki, can we back up a second when you're done with that?
Mm-hmm.
The low literacy levels?
The low literacy, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out there with the low literacy levels, we had a discussion about this amongst our intake staff, because based on our relationships with employers and where a lot of our students are obtaining employment, we kind of have a sense of what that means in terms of Best Plus 2.0 EFL levels. So, you know, that might be something where programs can get a little bit of a sense on what their employers are looking for optimal performance in the workplace. And for us, it's basically anything below the low intermediate level, where we're assessing someone with a Best Plus 2.0 and they're lower than that. Typically, that's what our employers are looking for in order to have that minimal functionality in the workplace. So that might be a wonderful to make if that helps people have a benchmark for their own programs.
That's a wonderful tip, Laura. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, we can rely on our partners in the community and our partners in the Department of Labor offices to maybe give us some help with those definitions. Wonderful. Thank you for that. All right. And again, we talked about this one a little bit already. Are my students who live in trailer parks homeless? I would say not necessarily. And again, you're looking at that fixed permanent address. as one of the guides to use there as well.
Becki, in terms of using these barriers to employment for potential integrated resource team meetings or for referral purposes, when you as an agency administrator or your staff have this intake and can identify some of these homeless individuals, is that a referral to workforce training or to the housing authority or to youth services, or does it just depend on so many other variables?
I think it really does depend on those variables, John. And obviously I think the housing is the first need, and the degree to which a person is homeless. Do they have a place that they are able to stay right now, even though it's not a permanent place? Are they safe there? Do they have someplace to go at night? Those kinds of things. If those aren't addressed, then those are the primary consideration, because nothing else really is going to be effective until we get them someplace safe to stay. And then beyond that, yes, I think that all of the other things that you mentioned would be appropriate referrals, depending on the situation. And again, there are so many other factors that go into each of these situations that I think that it's hard to predict what might happen in any given case with any given individual. So. How's that for a non-answer? That was like a bureaucrat answer.
I thought it was very well worded, and I know it was loaded to begin with because, yeah, to your point, how tenuous is the current situation? Is there no shelter whatsoever? Are there mental health and physical health issues, legal issues, and if we mark barriers, then are there expectant follow-ups for us? And I'm not trying to seem glib here, but I'm sure there are a host of reasons why our participants don't want to divulge certain personal information, or they don't even know how to respond to some of those things, and then us, be careful of what we ask. So again, I guess maybe more rhetorical questions in terms of reviewing barriers to employment and what that means for communication, coordination, and collaboration with our one-stop partners. Thank you.
Certainly. Yeah, I think that that's a very good point, John, that we do need to think about what we're going to do with this information after we collect it, how we're going to use it to help our participants be successful. Because they are barriers, not just to employment, but to their educational success with us as well. So, and is everyone who's unmarried and has a child a single parent? And again, we talked about this one a little bit. If they're not the primary custodial parent, then they would not necessarily be considered a single parent. So, oh, and then what's 70% of the lower living standard income level? And again, I gave you that cheat sheet, which is a good resource from our friends at Department of Labor. If I were you, I would just print it off and stick it by your desk somewhere so that you've got it when you're doing intake. That's what I plan to do with mine. So.
I'm sorry, can someone help me unpack that with some number sense? It's pretty clear to me, in terms of identifying family size, although I know that can even be complicated depending on, parents, boyfriends, and removed siblings and this and that. But those two metrics, it's one or the other, right? And help me understand that 70% of, please.
The 70% of, I think, is just the standard that labor uses to determine the metric that we're looking at here. So anybody who meets these standards, as you say, for the family size, which can sometimes be tricky to determine in and of itself, and is below the income that's stated for that family size, is going to be considered low income according to Department of Labor guidelines. We have not received anything from Department of Ed at the federal level that I know of, so I feel pretty comfortable going with these definitions. So yes, once you determine the family size in the home, then yes, it's an either or. So the, you know, the 6-month income is just half of the annual income, and whichever one they know. A lot of times our participants won't even know what their 6-month gross income is, and it is gross income, by the way. So you might just have to ask, you know, how much do you make an hour? How many hours do you work on average a week? And you might have to do the math to figure it. So, you know, and go ahead, John.
So Becki, if I'm in a family of 3 and I make $14,660 in a 6-month time frame, that's within 70% of that annual income figure. Is that what it's asking me in terms of the next income level? Because they certainly don't mean looking at the next family size field, do they, in that?
No, because
I
your
guess I
family
thought
size is your family size.
I guess I thought up this chart, DLR has already done the 70% calculation, figured out which is the greater, the 70%
Yes.
or the poverty line.
Right. So if they meet these low income guidelines, they are considered economically disadvantaged. So just flat these numbers. Kim, I'm remembering that right?
I'm sorry, say that again. You said if they're under this amount, they are economically disadvantaged.
Right.
Yes.
But we're not figuring 70% of this amount because Department of Labor is already
No,
done
that
it.
is the 70. That is the figure.
Right. Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank
That
you.
is
I'm
the
glad to know.
guideline.
Okay.
Thank you, Royce,
I just
and
wanted
thank you for the
yeah.
confirmation. So I can just look simply at those figures until they're updated
Right.
this spring and
Yes.
identify that if, okay.
Yeah, you don't have
Yes.
to do any other
Yes,
math.
exactly. Thank you, Kim. I just wanted to make sure I was remembering how to use that chart correctly.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
Mm-hmm.
So again, and there's the income sizes again, and remember, if you have a family over 6, which some of us do, that 5183 is part of the annual income for each additional person. So half of that if you're doing a 6-month income. And do I have to have documentation of these barriers? No, not at this time. We are not required to gather any documents that prove that these issues actually exist or are true. Our students, again, can self-report these things. So if they tell you, yes, I'm on EBT, you don't have to see the EBT card, and you certainly do not have to have a copy of it in the file. At this time, we're not documenting these barriers for Title II, which is a good thing. And then this is just kind of my mantra about this. Let student goals and common sense be your guides. You know, what are the students trying to achieve with us? Are those barriers going to be barriers to them achieving those goals? And again, use your common sense as much as possible. And I think we'll all be okay. I wanted to take a look at the new proposed intake form as well, and I had sent this out to all of you early as well. The required intake fields for reporting are designated by the white boxes on this form, and anything in a gray box is optional. Again, the intake information, including those barriers, should be updated for each period of performance. We're going to talk about periods of performance next week, so that will make more sense to you then. And you can actually include include additional information in the optional intake fields, or you can edit those optional intake fields for your local program use with John Anderson's approval. So I wanted to take a look at this is the latest draft of that student intake form, and you can see anything in a white box is required information according to NRS. So all the usual suspects are still in here. The gray boxes are optional information, and those are places where if you want to add fields in because you want to track something that NRS isn't tracking for some reason, you can certainly feel free to do that, but you do have to then submit that altered form to John Anderson for his approvals, just so he knows that you're not making any changes that involve required data that we need to report on. This form is fillable, so if you click in here, you actually can choose a date, you could type in it. The dialog boxes are not working right now, but they will. I don't know why they're not wanting to check in there, but they should be active checkboxes. And you'll see, again, as I said, all the usual information that has been required in the past. Some of these fields have changed. We talked a little bit about that in the LACES training on Friday. Some of the highest education level on entry fields have been eliminated, so this form reflects those changes. And the employment status also has been changed a bit. And then you'll see this section, does this person have barriers to employment, yes or no? And then you can pick as many of these barriers as apply to each student. And then you've got a lot of optional fields as well. And the release of information and student signature, as you can see, is still a required part of the form. We have to have the student signature on there in order to be able to include their information in LACES, so it's essential that we do get that signature. Any questions or comments about the form? We tried to make this one friendly for people who are doing it paper pencil as well as electronically, so there aren't drop-down fields anymore. That's why you see the huge proliferation of checkboxes, so you can see all the verbiage for all the fields. And I wanted to give you just a peek at Cornerstones actually has made some changes that we need to get John Anderson's approval for, but if we scroll down here, we actually did away with the corrections box because we're never going to serve anybody in a correctional facility, and that's the only thing that that corrections box is used for, because we don't get the 225 funding, so we're not going to serve anybody under 225 funding. So we did away with those boxes, and instead we added in, do you have internet in your home? Because that's important to us. We want to know that it affects some of the things that we're able to do with some of our students. We added in this box where we have asked for country of origin and how long have you lived. We ask for country of origin as well as how long have they lived in the U.S. and the language spoken at home. One of the things that we ask about the length of their stay in the U.S. for is so that we can make referrals to Refugee and Immigration Services if it's appropriate. If we've got somebody who's a secondary refugee, secondary, I can't think of the term now, but a secondary.
Secondary migrant.
Secondary migrant, thank you. And they're within that period of time where they would still be considered a secondary migrant for Lutheran Social Services. We can make that referral to Refugee and Immigration Services then. So we added that field in as well on our form. So we did make a couple of changes to those optional fields, and if John Anderson approves them after we submit the form to him, then we can go ahead and start using this form as our Cornerstones intake form moving forward.
I'd like to quickly thank you, Becki, and the rest of the PD team and your staff who helped us update and change this, and thank you for showing how you've started to adapt it. And I encourage locally, if we want to have some conversations and add some special secondary program drop downs for your agency that'll make your data tracking and your ancillary funding more justifiable. I think it'll be really easy to do with the template that Becki's sharing with us now, and still keep everything well organized for NRS and federal purposes as well as your local efforts. So thanks.
And if anybody has any questions about how to go in and make edits to that, you can always just contact me directly. I'm happy to help you in any way that I can in making the form the most usable it can be for you. So.
Thank you so much for drafting that, Becki.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I like doing it because then I can lay it out the way I want to for data entry. That's my secret.
That works for us.
Yeah, I did try and make it as data entry friendly as possible with the new LACES screens as well. So does anybody have any other questions or comments about the intake form or anything else that we've covered today?
Well, it's right at
If
3
not,
o'clock,
I was going to
so
say we are at the end of our time, so we did that pretty well. Thank you all for your attendance and for your input and your questions. We are all still learning all of the nuances of this, so I do appreciate all the questions and comments. They help us, as John said, to kind of form some questions to send up the line to our federal partners, and will help us all understand more fully in the end. And next week we'll be talking about those periods of performance. So if you're interested in learning more about those, you can tune in next week with us.
Thank you. Until then.
Thanks.